Hello and welcome everyone. I'm Tina Walia and I'm pleased to be your host today. This evening, we continue our health and wellness journey with our webinar, The Obesity Epidemic. Our distinguished speaker, Dr. Loren Grossman, explores the latest innovations in weight loss journey. The Ripple Effect Wellness Organization, or TRIVO, was founded by Dr. Sudhi Devanesan and Mr. Ravi Juneja in 2009. TRIVO's mission is to create healthy communities through education. One of our main goals is to inspire change at a personal level. Think of it as a ripple effect, a drop of information that challenges the status quo and spreads in ever widening circles to make a positive influence and generate significant results. The Webinar Outreach Wing, or WOW, is a branch of Trivo, and we have been serving our community for well over 7 years. We host a number of webinars throughout the year by inviting leading medical experts to empower and educate our audience. Tonight, we are extremely proud and humbled to share that our outreach has grown leaps and bounds over the past 4 years. Domestically within Canada to various municipalities and regions, through their libraries and community centers, and across all the provincial capitals and regions. Internationally, our audiences are from the US, the UK, Caribbean islands, the Netherlands, India, Sri Lanka, and Australia. Our audience ranged from teens and youth to adults and seniors. A special mention for the youth at University of Toronto and Sheridan College who have been supporting us. Lastly, the very special people, you, in our growing database of 1,500 members who convey to us through their ongoing support and attendance that our mission to empower people about their health and wellness is well worth our effort. We are also extremely grateful to our speakers, the doctors and medical experts who, over the last 5 years, have given up their time and knowledge freely, pro bono, without charging us. We are extremely grateful. Thank you. Now, moving on to our co founder and president of Trivo, Dr. Sudhi Devanesan. Dr. Devanesan is a family medicine physician, an educator, and a public health activist. He was inducted as a member of the Order of Canada in 2001 for his role in health and prevention of heart disease among South Asians. He's also been the chief of Department of Family and Community Medicine at St. Michael's Hospital. It is my honor to introduce Dr. Sudhi Devanesan to you all.
Thank you very much, Tina, for that wonderful introduction. And welcome, ladies and gentlemen, all of you who are watching. We're so thrilled that you can join us this evening. And we start the new year with this particular webinar. We have lots of programs that are coming up this year, exciting new and innovative projects. And it will unfold and shared with you as the time goes on. I want to congratulate the team that put this webinar together, worked very hard to get this going, and particularly to Dr. Loren Grossman, who I've known for many, many years, even from the time he was a student, that he accepted our invitation and is going to address us today. Thank you so much, Loren. Now, we can look forward to many things in our lives, but we are often rushed, we are often harassed, stressed, and we seem to be in a constant state of turmoil, a never-ending stream of challenges. wanting to reestablish hope, wanting to reestablish some calm. And there is a word that I want to introduce to you today. And the word is an Aboriginal word from the Northern Territories of Australia, where my brother used to work. The name of I'm going to introduce is Dadiri, D-A-D-I-R-I, D-A-D-I-R-I. Dadiri is a verb. It comes from a tribe, and what it tries to capture is a contemplative, quiet stillness and awareness, and a spiritual tuning in to each other, as well as into nature. It's a profoundly humble, receptive awareness of the world around us. Because when we listen with the spirit of Dadiri, we become conscious of the depth and the meaning of our place in this world. So, ladies and gentlemen, I give you the word Dadiri. Thank you. And back to you, Tina.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sudhi, for continuing to enrich our vocabulary with a new word every webinar. I would like to remind the audience about the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. And I would also like to mention that a recording of this webinar will be emailed to all the registrants within the next few days. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, Dr. Loren Grossman, to you all. Dr. Loren Grossman is a specialist in internal medicine, endocrinology, and metabolism. He's presented numerous research papers and has been invited to lectures and published clinical research and reviews in leading medical journals. A very warm welcome to you, Dr. Loren Grossman.
Well, thank you very much, Tina. And let me get my slides up for you as we start. And there we go. Well, thank you again, Tina, for that kind introduction. And I'd also like to thank Doctors Devanesan, Sudhi, and Asha for inviting me to speak with you today. And I'd like to say a good evening, good afternoon, and good morning to everyone across Canada and around the world who have tuned in to this webinar this evening. Tonight, I'm going to speak with you in the next 30 minutes or so about the obesity epidemic. What's the big deal? And let me start. Okay. You can see everything. It's not going. There we go. Just want to mention that I participate in a number of clinical research studies as well as consult with a number of pharmaceutical companies, both for obesity and other medical conditions, including the ones listed on the slide here. I want to point out that none of these companies were involved in the development of this presentation. So over the next 30 minutes, what I'd like to share with you is a number of items. We'll talk about what is obesity, why is it considered an epidemic, some of the causes and complications of obesity, and treatment for obesity. And I also want to point out that I will be discussing obesity in adults only. There are specifics related to obesity in children and adolescents, which I won't be getting into this evening. So what is obesity? The World Health Organization defines obesity as an excess of adiposity, which simply means fat tissue. And the important thing here is that it increases health risks. And we'll discuss that a little more a little later on. We currently measure obesity with what's called a body mass index. And the body mass index calculation is shown on the slide. It's simply relating the weight to the height with the weight over the height squared, expressed in the SI units of kilograms and meters. And we'll also talk a little bit about some of the limitations of using the body mass index, but nevertheless, that is what we are currently using. The World Health Organization defines a normal BMI as between 18.5 and up to about 25. Overweight, or an intermediary zone, between 25 and just under 30. And obesity is considered a body mass index of greater than 30. We can go on to classify different levels of obesity. And you can see here, class 1 obesity is defined as a BMI in the 30s, 30 to 35, class 2, 35 to 40, and class 3, 40 to, some people consider anything above 40 to be class 3. Some groups go on and define classes 4 and 5 as listed there on the slide. But what has also occurred is that a group, particularly in Canada, out of Edmonton, where a lot of the work on Obesity Canada is stationed, have defined a staging system whereby you can see, I hope you can see my pointer here, the classes that I've listed here, but go on and then try to define whether the obesity is actually causing clinical problems or not. And that's the key going forward, and I'll talk about that also a little later on as some very recent information has hit the press. But you can see here that for stage 0 and stage 1 obesity, if the patient is not having any clinical manifestations of being obese, for example, in here you see a physically active female with a body mass index of 32, but has no other risk factors, no physical symptoms, no self-esteem issues, and no functional limitations from the obesity, then we consider that stage 0. And really at this point, with either stage 0 or stage 1, where some of these things are extremely mild, patients don't necessarily need to have anything else done. We used to call these people the fit fat. That's not really a very good term to use anymore. And so we now have a staging system where, in addition to the class, we can look at whether they have some established physical findings, more significant or more severe, and stage them that way. So you can see now that an emphasis is being made on not only the actual BMI and the weight, but whether it's actually causing some health-related issues or clinical manifestations. And why is the BMI so important? Well, because this and a number of other studies have shown that there is a relationship between body mass index and various health issues. In this particular slide, I'm showing body mass index on the bottom and the risk of mortality, overall mortality, on the going upwards here on the y-axis. And this is for both healthy never smoker individuals and all subjects in this particular study. And what you can see is that there is this U-shaped curve, which means that at a higher BMI, there is an increased risk of mortality. But at a lower BMI, there's also a higher risk, increased risk of mortality. And you can see sort of the sweet spot here, where the risk is not greater, ranges anywhere from a BMI of about 22 up to about 30. This and other studies have been the impetus for deciding that a body mass index of over 30 is considered obesity. But what's interesting to see here as well is that the mortality goes up even at a body mass index less than 22. You may recall from the previous slide that I said the World Health Organization defines normal as down to 18.5. But on this and other studies, there is a suggestion that even at that low BMI, there may be an increased risk of health-related issues, and we may need to revisit the actual lower definition of what BMI should be. But as I mentioned, there are limitations in using strictly the BMI as an assessment of health risk. One of the limitations is fat distribution. And here you see the fat can be distributed in the body in different ways. Here you see individuals who have more of the fats, what's called centrally, or visceral obesity, which means that the fat tissue is not only under the skin, but it's also in the abdomen and surrounding a lot of the essential organs there. And that is more of a health risk and has been shown to be more of a health risk than this type of obesity, where it could be under the skin, below the waist, in the hips, sometimes in the arms as well, but not so central. There are various terms for these different types of fat distribution. This has been called android or male pattern, although it certainly doesn't only occur in males, and this is called gynecoid. Or you can see that it's also called apple shape because it looks like an apple here, versus pear shaped here because it's more shaped like a pear. These people would have the same body mass index, but clearly these individuals are at a higher risk for health issues compared to this individual. One of the other limitations of body mass index is body composition, that being fat versus muscle. And you can see two individuals here on this slide, both of the same height, both of approximately the same weight, and both would have the same body mass index. But this individual is much more muscular, and this individual has more fat tissue. And you can see that apple shape, visceral or central obesity shown here on this individual, who is clearly at a higher risk for cardiovascular events compared to this individual who is much more muscular. Yet the BMI is the same, and there's another limitation. So given these limitations, researchers have gone on to try to identify other ways of better assessing obesity and health risk. And one of the ways, based on what I've just shown you, is looking at the waist circumference. Now, different organizations suggest measuring the waist circumference in different ways, so that can be a problem and can be very confusing. You can see here the World Health Organization suggests we measure waist circumference halfway between the bottom of the rib cage and the top of the pelvic bone, both in a male and a female here, while the National Institutes of Health in the US suggests we just measure the waist circumference at the top of the hip bone right there. Either way, go back. Either way, what we simply do is just take a tape measure and measure around at that location without putting too much pressure to measure the waist circumference. And you can see that a smaller waist circumference would impart less of a health risk than a larger one. And the general recommendations are a waist circumference in women of about 35 inches and in men of about 40 inches, above which would increase the risk of cardiovascular and other health-related diseases. So researchers, and the other thing people can do is that instead of just looking at the waist by itself, there's others who have suggested to look at the waist to hip ratio to get a better idea of what the appropriate waist should be given the size of the hips as well. And a ratio should be less than 1 because you can see that the waist should be smaller than the hips to impart less of a health risk. And it's recommended a waist to hip ratio of less than 0.9 in men and 0.85 in women would be considered a healthy reading. So to try to put this all together, more recently, some researchers have tried to combine the body mass index with the waist circumference and have come up with a novel new index called the body roundness index. And what this basically does is describe the body, as you see here, as an ellipse, which is an elongated circle shown here. And they've taken the formula. For those of you who are mathematically inclined, you can see the formula to calculate the body roundness index is here. It takes into consideration an ellipse, as well as looking at the waist circumference, which would be this measurement of the ellipse, and the height, which would be this measurement of the ellipse. And you're looking at the roundness of the body to get a better idea of whether there is an increased health risk or not. And shown here are examples. You can see in the green here and the red, here are two individuals who have the same height, who have the same weight, therefore they have the same BMI, but this individual has a smaller waist circumference of 73 versus 93 centimeters. So his ellipse is narrower, and this individual has a wider ellipse and therefore has a greater body roundness index. And here's another example of a taller, slim individual who has a larger height, a larger weight. Body mass index would be the same, but because the waist circumference here is smaller, this ellipse is more elongated, and he would have a smaller or lower body roundness index. And therefore, you may hear more about a body roundness index, waist circumference, waist to hip ratio, rather than just looking at body mass index. And in fact, a normal body roundness index is considered to be between around 4.5 to 5.5. And you can see that this has also been looked at in relation to overall mortality. And you can see here that here's the range between 4.5 and 5.5, where there is no increase in mortality. But again, we see this U-shaped curve where with a lower roundness index, there might be increase, and with a higher roundness index, there's an increase in health-related risks as well. So just recently, really hot off the press, at least here in Canada on our local CBC News service, was a report of a study that came out just a couple of weeks ago trying to come up with better definitions for obesity and moving away from the body mass index here. And here you see one of our researchers in Hamilton who was involved in this paper. It was a commission that was put together to try to find a better definition and diagnostic criteria of obesity, and came up with definitions of what they call clinical obesity. And this was published in the prestigious medical journal, The Lancet, just a couple of weeks ago. And what they said, and this is from the paper, that current BMI-based measures of obesity can both underestimate and overestimate adiposity and provide inadequate information about health. So they want to differentiate between what they call preclinical and clinical obesity. And that goes back to what we said earlier, whether or not the obesity is actually causing health-related issues or not. They define clinical, or they'd like to define clinical obesity as a chronic systemic illness characterized by alterations in the functions of tissues, organs, or the individual. In other words, it causes health issues. And clinical obesity can lead to severe end organ damage, causing life-altering and potentially life-threatening complications, as shown here. And they will define preclinical obesity as a state of excess adiposity with preserved function of other tissues, what we used to call the fit fat or the fat fit, and organs, but have an increased risk of developing clinical obesity, but separating preclinical from clinical obesity. And we may hear a lot more about that as the research progresses in the future. So moving on to the next topic, why is obesity considered an epidemic? Well, here is data in Canada, where I live, and you can see this shows the percentage of the population here having a BMI of greater than 30, and the green and the yellow are lower percentages, and orange and red are getting up into 30 and 35%. And you can see the data from 2005 going up to what we have here in 2018. And in 2005, there was a lot of green and yellow, so 20, 25%. But as we go through the years, you can see that there's getting to be less green, more yellow, more orange, and now we're starting with some reds. And by 2018, only one province had green and the rest were all in the higher percentage. So the prevalence of obesity in the population is going up in Canada. In our neighbors to the south, the situation is even worse. And here you see similar data showing overall obesity of a BMI greater than 30 on this panel here. And this is the prevalence of severe obesity with a BMI of greater than 35. And you can see data starting from 1990, going up to 2020, and then projections out to 2030. And again, you can see that the yellows and the greens here are the lower percentages, and the reds and the blues are the higher percentages. And you can see here a lot of just yellow. Here we're getting a little more orange and red. By 2020, almost the whole country was red, and it's projected there are going to be some blues and purples up to 50 or 60% of the population by 2030. So given this data and other information that researchers have gathered over the years, statements were made such as, these data show that obesity increased in every state, in both sexes, and across all age groups, races, educational levels, and smoking status. And I highlight here, rarely do chronic conditions such as obesity spread with the speed and dispersion characteristic of a communicable disease epidemic. And hence, the term was coined the obesity epidemic because it was spreading so rapidly, just like an infectious disease. However, all is not lost. All is not lost. Here is the latest data just published this year in JAMA Health Forum in 2024. And again, we see the percentage of the population with a body mass index of greater than 30 over the years here. And you can see that it's going up, 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 up until 2021. 2022, it started to plateau. And look what happened here in 2023. It actually went down. Yeah, that is down a little bit, but it isn't up. It's down a little bit. And that's suggesting that maybe this epidemic is stopping and maybe starting to reverse a bit. Maybe because of some of our better understanding of what causes obesity, and maybe because of our treatments that we've developed over the years. So there is hope that maybe things are starting to change. Let me move on now. I'd like to talk a little bit about the causes of obesity. It's very complicated, and in this half an hour or so presentation, I can just touch on the surface, and we'll talk about the complications as well. So obesity, actually, it's very simple. It really is one of the laws of physics: energy in equals energy out. And in the case of us people, energy in means the food we eat, and energy out is a combination of our basal metabolism, the energy we need just to live. We need energy for our heart to beat. We need energy to breathe. We need energy for our muscles to have tone to allow us to sit in chairs and just do basic basal things that we need to sustain life for our bowels, etc. Plus physical activity that we engage in as well. If the food intake is greater than the overall energy out, then the energy is stored in the body, and it's stored primarily, not all, but primarily in the adipose tissue or the fat cells. So the causes of obesity are multifactorial, and they can be divided into genetics, the environment, and metabolic causes. And let me go through a little bit about each of these for you. Genetics is very complicated and not well understood, because you can see here the literature quotes the hereditability of body mass index has been estimated anywhere from 40 to 70%. So that's a huge range and indicates it's not really that well understood. Monogenic obesity, which means a genetic defect in one gene causing obesity, it does occur, but it's very rare. There are certain genetic conditions that are associated with obesity, but that's not the majority of causes in most people with obesity. And one of the issues that makes this so complicated is that genetics is involved in everything and can affect various aspects of obesity. It can affect your food preference. It can affect energy regulation. It can affect your cholesterol and other lipid metabolism. It can affect your ability to do physical activity. So there are a whole host of genetic factors that are very difficult to identify and isolate, but they exist as a cause of obesity. What about environmental factors? Another area where there's lots of issues that occur in the environment, just some of them listed here, including the availability of food, and food security can be a factor. Consumption patterns, cultural food preferences all play a role, socioeconomic factors, and let's not forget medications. There are a number of medications that people take for other health conditions that can result in weight gain and obesity. And if you think that's complicated, the metabolic factors related to obesity are even more complicated. But this is where we've made a lot of progress in the past years in understanding what's going on and what is regulating food intake, food storage, and obesity. And we see that the brain is a major and central part of the control of food. And you can see that here in the diagram. Here are some of the organs that are involved in food intake, the stomach, the bowel, the fat tissues, etc., where storage occurs. There is a great interaction and communication among these different organs and the brain. For example, here there are various factors that are secreted by the fat cells. Even though they are storage depots, the fat cells are still very metabolically active. They don't just sit there and store things and don't do anything. They're very metabolically active. They secrete a number of hormones and factors that tell the brain how they're doing. And there are also various factors that are secreted by the bowel that indicate to the brain how things are going and whether it needs to increase food intake or not. For example, when fat cells start to decrease in the amount that is there, they start increasing some of these factors to tell the brain, hey, there's less of us here. Eat more food to make us get back to where we were before. And if any of you have tried dieting, you're aware that after a while it gets very frustrating because one reaches a plateau and one notices that the hunger gets worse. Well, part of that is because of these metabolic factors, both these that are telling the brain, well, I'm losing fat, eat more, get more fat here. Or there are factors from the stomach that tell the brain, I don't have enough food, I'm hungry, give me more food. Or even just physical features in the stomach, like distension and motility, can work through the nervous system to tell the brain to eat more. So there's a whole mechanism there of communication between various organs that are involved in obesity and the brain that need to be addressed in order to overcome some of the genetic factors that may be causing obesity in the first place. So what about the complications of obesity? In addition to these things causing obesity, these can also be affected by obesity. And this is a nice diagram I took from this paper that was published last year. And you can see obesity here in the center with the various complications around it that I'll go through with you briefly in the next few minutes. But one important thing we need to mention is the stigma and discrimination. There's still a lot of misinformation and discrimination and misunderstanding about what causes obesity. A lot of people will tell people that are obese, oh, it's all just in your head. Why don't you just close your mouth and you'll lose weight? Stop eating so much. And we have to remind people that this is not a character flaw. This is not a lack of motivation or trying. There are all these things that I just showed you, genetics, environmental factors, metabolic factors that are working against them in their attempt to lose weight. And we need to get around this idea that it's just all in your head and you should just try harder in order for them to be able to address some of the complications of obesity. These complications can be divided again into sort of three general areas: behavioral and mental health complications, metabolic complications, and mechanical complications. And if we go through these briefly, behavioral and mental health complications include things such as depression and anxiety. Obesity can cause these, and they can also be caused by this. So there's a vicious circle there as well. Same with eating disorders, can be caused by obesity and can cause obesity, and these need to be addressed. Metabolic complications are very important. I showed you the metabolic causes of obesity, but here obesity can lead to a number of metabolic complications. These health issues that we talked about earlier that define clinical versus preclinical obesity. These can include cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, high blood pressure, diabetes, increased lipids. This is liver disease. There are a number of cancers that have an increased incidence with obesity, and even infertility can be caused through PCOS and other mechanisms by obesity. And then there are just mechanical complications of obesity, just by the fact that you have extra mass on your body and you're trying to maintain it, can lead to things such as osteoarthritis, can lead to respiratory failure, respiratory problems, can lead to sleep apnea, can lead to gastroesophageal reflux, urinary problems, skin infections, etc. So all of these factors, behavioral, metabolic, and mechanical, can all eventually lead to problems leading to a decreased quality of life and social well-being. All right, in the last few minutes, let me talk a little bit about our current treatments for obesity. And a lot of the information I'm going to share with you about this comes from our own Canadian Adult Obesity Clinical Practice Guidelines, which comes from Obesity Canada, an organization dedicated to the treatment and research in obesity. These were published in 2020 in our Canadian Medical Association Journal. They're also available online, and the online version is updated regularly as new information comes forward. So a lot of the information I'm going to share with you comes from these guidelines. They suggest the treatment of obesity should be considered in the following way. Obesity is a chronic disease, and it should be considered a chronic disease caused by abnormal or excess body fat accumulation. And again, the important feature here, as we've heard about this evening, which impairs health. It's a complex and heterogeneous chronic disease, which means there are multiple things going on that do not present in the same way in all patients, and that requires individualized treatment and long-term support, like any other complex disease. Weight bias in healthcare settings can reduce the quality of care for patients living with obesity, and adults living with obesity should receive individualized care plans that address their root cause and provide support for the following components: behavioral, nutrition, physical activity, therapies, which may include psychological, pharmacologic, and surgical interventions. So here are the components of the treatment of obesity, and I'll go through each one of these quickly. I know I'm running a little bit out of time, but hopefully, if everyone will let me, I'll continue for the next few minutes. The components include nutrition, exercise, psychological and behavioral issues, pharmacotherapy or drugs, and bariatric surgery. Nutrition. Adopting a healthy, well-balanced eating pattern requiring a long-term reduction in caloric intake. Energy in must be less than energy out. But long-term adherence to a healthy eating pattern that is personalized to meet individual values and preferences while fulfilling nutritional needs is an important element of managing health and weight. And again, it's important to remember that nutrition therapy should not be used in isolation, as sustaining weight loss may be difficult long-term because of the compensatory mechanisms that I showed you earlier that promote a positive caloric intake by increasing hunger and ultimately causing weight gain again. So these need to be addressed. Nutritional therapy in combination with the other interventions that I showed you, psychological, pharmacologic, surgical, etc., should be tailored to meet an individual's health-related or weight-related outcomes. Exercise. Aerobic activity of about 30 to 60 minutes on most days of the week, or about 150 minutes per week, is recommended and can lead to a small amount of weight and fat loss, improvements in cardiometabolic parameters, and weight maintenance. The weight loss achieved with these behavioral changes usually is about 3 to 5%, but that's often enough to result in meaningful improvements in obesity-related complications. That's often enough to improve cholesterol levels. That's often enough to reduce prediabetes back to normal, or to move someone from a diabetes range back into prediabetes. The amount of weight loss varies substantially among individuals, depending upon the other factors that I've listed today, and again, is not just simply related to individual effort. The psychological and behavioral changes must be multi-component psychological interventions like behavior modification, cognitive therapy, and other strategies to alter diet and activity, and this should be incorporated into care plans for weight loss and improved health status. Let's talk a little bit about the medications or pharmacotherapy. It's recommended by the guidelines that pharmacotherapy for weight loss can be used for persons with a BMI of greater than 30 or a BMI of greater than 27 with adiposity-related complications. But again, in conjunction with medical, nutritional therapy, physical activity, psychological interventions, the things I mentioned earlier. Not one of these by themselves will really address the problem and result in meaningful and significant weight loss. And I've had patients who say, well, if I take this medication, can I then eat what I want? Well, no, you cannot, unfortunately. It won't let you, some of them, for one thing, but you need to incorporate this along with the other components. I've shown you here the currently available medications in Canada. This could be different in other countries. We have here in Canada what's called Contrave. It's a combination of two medications, naltrexone and bupropion, orlistat, and the newer medications called the GLP-1 or the glucagon-like peptide 1 agonists, because they act like a natural hormone, but in much higher levels in the body, known here as liraglutide or Saxenda, and the most recent Wegovy semaglutide. This is the same medication as in the infamous Ozempic, but here in Canada, Ozempic is really indicated only for diabetes, and the other formulation of semaglutide here, Wegovy, is for weight loss. And briefly showing you some of the characteristics of these compounds. They work quite differently and have different effects. The Contrave works on different brain neurotransmitters to reduce hunger and cravings. You can expect about a 5% weight loss with this medication. I'm not a big fan of it because it does have fairly significant side effects, including cardiovascular and gastrointestinal, so I tend not to use it that much. Orlistat or Xenical works in a different way. It stays in your gastrointestinal system and blocks an enzyme that allows fat absorption. Fat has the highest calorie density of all the nutrients. It has 9 calories per gram versus carbs and protein, which have 4. So if you reduce fat absorption, you can reduce food intake or the absorption of the food and calories. You can expect about a 4% reduction in weight loss with this medication, but, and this is a big but, really, not figuratively and literally, you have to really restrict your fat intake. If you don't restrict your fat intake in your diet, you will overwhelm this enzyme blockage, and it will result in a very unpleasant side effect. The next medications, as I mentioned, are the GLP-1s. These are the newer medications that are injectable for weight loss. They act by increasing a naturally occurring hormone to a much higher level. This hormone has multiple effects throughout the body, some of which include reducing weight by reducing the appetite. They work on the brain to reduce appetite. They also work on the gastrointestinal system to slow the absorption and the transit of the system. Therefore, when you eat less some food, you will feel fuller faster and will stop eating sooner. With the Saxenda, you can expect about a 6% weight loss. With the Wegovy, you can expect now up to 12% or so weight loss. And the side effects are, again, gastrointestinal because of the way they work, typically more commonly nausea or vomiting, constipation, etc. There are other medications that are available around the world, not here in Canada. There's another combination of neuroendocrine neurotype medications. And there is tirzepatide, which is known as Zepbound in other countries. Here we do have tirzepatide in Canada. It's known as Mounjaro. But again, the Mounjaro preparation of tirzepatide is for diabetes. That is available here, but the Zepbound formulation for weight loss is not yet available. In the last few minutes, let me talk a little bit about bariatric surgery. Bariatric surgery can be considered with people for a greater BMI of greater than 40 or for greater than 35 with at least one adiposity-related disease, but it can be considered for weight loss and to control diseases in persons with class 1 obesity that's greater than 30, in whom optimal medical and behavioral management has been insufficient. In other words, it hasn't worked, and then they consider this. The choice of procedure, which I'll show you on the next slide, is decided according to the patient's needs, but also in collaboration with an experienced interprofessional team. And it's really important, that last part. You really can't just go to anybody for bariatric surgery. You really need to go, if you're going to have surgery, to a surgeon who has special expertise in bariatric surgery. In Ontario here, where I practice, we have an Ontario Bariatric Network where we can refer patients to a central triage center, and they will look at their specific individual needs, where they live, which center is best for them, and set them up with an appropriate interdisciplinary team to get the appropriate care they need. This shows you some of the procedures that have been available. One of the first was what's called adjustable gastric band, which is basically just putting a band around the bottom of the esophagus, top of the stomach there, so there's less food getting into the stomach. That is not really done anymore. There are a lot of complications, and it's been supplanted by some of these newer procedures. A very common procedure is the sleeve gastrectomy, and you can see here, this is the stomach here, the esophagus and the bowel, and they just cut away part of the stomach, so the stomach is smaller, can't accommodate as much food, and you eat less. One of sort of the gold standards is called the Roux-en-Y gastric bypass. That's the French that just means like a Y, because you can see here, there's a Y shape here of your bowel, and what they basically do is bypass the stomach. They bring a piece of intestine right up to a little part of the top of the stomach here, bypass the big part, and allows the food to completely bypass the stomach and go into a smaller bowel. Therefore, you have less capacity, you eat less, and you lose weight that way. And then a little more complicated is called the duodenal switch, which is sort of a combination of both. You can see they take out part of the stomach here, like the sleeve gastrectomy, but they also cut out part of the bowel from here to here and pull up some of the bowel from lower down. So you have a smaller stomach, you have less small bowel to absorb the food, and you lose weight that way. You can expect up to a 25% weight loss with the Roux-en-Y. So I showed you the data with Wegovy up to 12%, but now with some of the newer medications that aren't here in Canada yet for obesity, we are seeing now some of the medications are also achieving up to about 20-25% weight loss. So some of our newer medications are now starting to approach the same weight loss that we're seeing now with bariatric surgery. Bariatric surgery has been shown to reduce health-related complications of obesity, reduce the risk of heart disease, stroke, and cancer. Side effects, very low perioperative mortality rates in the hands of good surgeons. It's quite safe. There are some complications that need to be addressed, but in the hands of good surgeons and good surgical centers, this can be really minimized. And again, like the others, you can't just have the surgery and say, okay, good, now I can just go and do what I want. No, you can't. You still have to, and you can see, you just can't eat as much, and you shouldn't be eating as much when you have bariatric surgery, because there's reduced capacity to have the food, and if you overstuff yourself, you will not feel well and could negate some of the effects of the surgery. Because of the decreased absorption in the bowel, there can be vitamin and mineral deficiencies in the micronutrients, and therefore people do need to take extra supplements. And of course, it's important to remember that some of the medications that people were taking before for the diabetes, high blood pressure, etc., as these complications diminish because of the surgery, they might be able to get off a number of these medications. So to summarize what I've said to you in the past 30 or 40 minutes or so, obesity is a complex chronic disease that affects a large number of adults in Canada and globally. Newer insights into appetite regulation and the causes of obesity have opened new avenues for treating this chronic disease. And reducing weight bias and stigma, understanding the root causes of obesity, promoting and supporting behavioral interventions and appropriate treatment will raise the standards of care and improve the well-being of people living with obesity. And with that, I thank you very much for your attention and for tuning in, and I turn it back to Tina.
Your deep dive into obesity has been educational for me, and I'm sure for our audience as well. It is encouraging to note that the trend in Canada is reversing as the community at large is gravitating towards healthier food and lifestyle choices. Thank you so much, Dr. Grossman.
Very welcome.
Moving on now to the Q&A part of the webinar, I would like to invite Dr. Sudhi to moderate the Q&A session with Dr. Grossman. Please submit your questions through Q&A chat box at the bottom of the screen.
Loren, thank you very much for that very comprehensive overview of obesity and the impact of obesity on health and ultimately on the healthcare system. As a practicing family physician for 55 years, one of the things that I have constantly wondered about was with the huge explosion of fast food and the availability and the way people work now with both members of the family working, it's much easier to get fast food. And the fast food industry is probably one of the biggest contributors towards the environmental factors that you were talking about in terms of the food chain and food intake. The second thing is that there seems to be less and less people willing to take the effort to start cooking their meals at home, whether it's a question of time or whether it's a question of learning how to do those things. And I would like just a quick comment from you about those two factors. There are, of course, cultural ones that you mentioned very briefly. And we know in some communities that the carbohydrate intake is very high, particularly the rice eaters and flour eaters in almost every meal. So just covering those three important elements, as a family doctor, we face these things on a regular basis in terms of counseling our patients about the environment. So if you could just quickly respond to those and give us your take on what we can do in terms of I mean,
Well,
there's such a strong lobby, and it's frustrating sometimes.
I think you raise, Sudi, some very good points. Those are very important and significant environmental factors that I think are responsible for the obesity. The fast food companies are very good at marketing and very good at presenting their advertising, not only to adults, but to children who, how many kids don't want to go to McDonald's because they see it on TV and get a toy. And that sets up poor eating habits going forward as an adult. And unfortunately, it's very difficult. I think you raise good points. I wish I had an answer as to how we could address some of those environmental factors other than people realizing it, unfortunately, for themselves. I mean, I can think of one particular patient I saw more in the lipid clinic than at St. Mike's when I was at St. Mike's, than an obesity clinic, but his cholesterol levels were sky high. And when I went through with him and asked him what he was, what his environmental, what his habits were, he was of Chinese descent, and he basically told me that he was just so busy with his work that all of his meals, and I mean, he said all of his meals were in the local Chinese restaurant. Everything. That's all he ate because he didn't have time for anything else. So instead of putting him on a medication, we tried to convince him that maybe by changing his eating habits in that way, that would improve things and he wouldn't need to be on medication. And in fact, when we saw him back in follow-up, he was able to change his habits and start cooking for himself and eating better. And of course, we hooked him up with our dietitian and his cholesterol levels came right down and didn't need medication. So perhaps the incentive of not having to go on medication might be an incentive to get patients to improve their eating habits. Unfortunately, a lot of people can't, and there's a lot of the socioeconomic factors that are involved, and food security, and the inability to afford unfortunately, healthy foods tend to cost more. And people who have very little disposable income have a great difficult time in being able to choose what are the good foods they can buy and what they can use their money elsewhere for. So it's a real societal and environmental problem that we're facing. And unfortunately, with some of these tariffs we hear about starting next week, a lot of our fresh produce comes from the US, and that might make it even more difficult here for us to be able to make healthy food choices. So it's not just genetics and all in our head. There's a lot, like you've identified, a lot of environmental factors that are difficult to control.
Thank you, Loren. Couple of questions that have come in. Um, what is the difference between a healthy weight as opposed to an ideal weight? And how do you address or determine this?
That's a good question. So the term ideal body weight comes from the body mass index. So the body mass index between 18 or 20 or 25 is considered an ideal weight. But people who are overweight, and I've had this question posed to me from a number of patients, just because people who are overweight don't need to get to their ideal weight to get to a healthy weight. And as I mentioned earlier, even losing a small 3 to 5% of your body weight, which in many people might represent 5, 8 pounds. People who come in with BMIs of 30 think they need to lose 25, 30, 35 pounds to get to their ideal BMI. And when I tell them, no, if you lose 5, 8 pounds, that may be enough. You're not going to be down to your ideal weight, but that may be enough to reduce or reverse some of the health-related complications you're having from the weight, and that may be enough for you. And that actually makes them much happier because they come in thinking they have to get down to their ideal weight based on BMI, when a healthy weight might be a much less of a reduction. And that's a bit of a motivating thing. And that's a very, very individualized as well.
Thank you. Now, there's a question about who can prescribe these medications. You mentioned the GLP-1s, and you mentioned Orlistat and Xenical. I mean, I know I used to prescribe Orlistat and Xenical, but I never prescribed Ozempic or Wegovy or any of those things. So the question has come in, can it only be under a specialist, or can family doctors also prescribe?
So, I mean, technically and legally speaking, any doctor who's licensed to prescribe can prescribe any medication they wish, as you know. I don't think these medications need to be restricted to specialists. And I know Obesity Canada, with their clinical practice guidelines, is trying to get the word out so that the guidelines can be used by primary care physicians to help them in determining when this type of medication is appropriate or not. And so if a family physician is quite comfortable in reading and understanding the guidelines and using these medications, that I don't see a reason why family physicians who are comfortable can do so. Certainly, I know a number of family physicians who are prescribing Ozempic for diabetes, and there are similar guidelines as I've shown you here. I just gave a brief overview, but there's very, very nice papers and a website dedicated to this to help guide the criteria for when to prescribe these medications. I think one of the biggest barriers is coverage. And Ozempic is covered. Well, anyone under 65, of course, will have to have private insurance. But over 65, Ontario Drug Benefit, at least here in Ontario, Ozempic is covered for diabetes management, but Wegovy is not covered for weight management. A number of private health insurance companies are now starting to cover these medications, but it's variable from company to company. But I think family doctors get familiar with the guidelines if they see a lot of people with obesity, and certainly go ahead and prescribe it.
Thank you.
There aren't enough of my specialists to go around for all the people who have obesity in this country. So there aren't enough family doctors either, as you know.
So some of the other questions that have come in, one was that can you identify maybe the 3 most important reasons why this epidemic of obesity exploded?
That's a good question. I think from what I've read, that the most important reasons are probably the environmental factors. I mean, our genetics haven't changed. I mean, they change, but they haven't changed that much. And the metabolic causes we're learning about, but they've been there. We just didn't know about them, about all the interactions between the brain and the gut. That's always been there. We just discovered them more recently. But I think the biggest reason has been environmental factors. Like you said, the availability of fast food, the proliferation of fast food restaurants, the convenience, the hectic lifestyle we all lead now, decreased ability to spend some time at home, to do the shopping, to buy the healthy foods, to have the appropriate funds to be able to buy the healthy foods when it's much more convenient to just buy a box of Kraft Dinner and or chicken nuggets or something and throw them in the microwave. So I think these environmental factors over the years have probably played the biggest role in the so-called epidemic.
Yeah, I think also, Loren, the inactivity has now been put as a
Yes.
risk factor.
Yes.
And the type of work we do, from being working on farms and fields and, hunter warrior gatherers, etc., has changed. We sit a lot, we move less, and that contributes also.
Yes.
Um, and I think, the different, again, I come back to culture, the use of oil, the use of bread in large amounts is another contributing factor. Um, Thank you. I think we've covered quite a few of the questions, especially about the fast-paced life. Somebody kind of alluded to the fact that because it's so fast-paced, they may be eating less. And I think starvation diets, as you know, the keto diet and some of these other ones. Do you have any pearls that you can tell us about those particular diets?
Sure, but I don't think people are eating less. I think people are probably eating more poorly in that the fast-paced lifestyle means grab a sandwich here, or grab a burger there and eat on the go. And they're eating less good quality foods, high density, high calorie foods, less fiber, more sugary foods, higher salt, that kind of thing. So unfortunately, they may be eating a less quantity, but because it's high density, poor nutrition, it's contributing to the obesity. And the other question you asked was,
The other question was, yeah, I think you already covered it earlier on. So, the lifestyle one, despite eating, you know, the about fasting,
oh yes,
whether
yes,
it,
the different diets. Yes, that's right. So yeah, there are a bunch of fad diets out there. Some of them do work well. Some of them do not work well. You mentioned keto, for example. Keto probably works well for a short-term weight loss. But the problem with keto, a couple of problems with keto. Number one is that it's not sustainable in the long term. And number two, unless you're very careful about the kinds of protein foods that you're eating, it tends to result in very high cholesterol levels. And I have also seen through my work at the St. Mike's Lipid Clinic when I was there, people coming in with very high lipid levels because when we investigated, they were on a keto diet. And when we explained to them about a better diet to follow to help with some weight loss or whatever they wanted, the cholesterol levels improved dramatically. So these kinds of fad diets, a lot of the fad diets are all very similar and just remarketing in different ways. As far as diets go in general, again, as I showed on the slides, a good I mean, I can't get into the details about a dietary therapy now, but just a good overall healthy diet that addresses macro and micronutrient needs and addresses the reduction in overall caloric intake with the other features is a good way to lose weight. There are some very good weight loss programs out there. Again, it needs to be individualized to the patient's particulars. Some people will do well with one versus the other. I particularly refer people to either what used to be called Weight Watchers, now WW, Noom, Jenny Craig. Those are good overall, Nutrisystem. Those are good general overall weight management programs if people want to address it that way.
Thank you, Loren. We're coming towards the end of our questions. Just one, I think, is a very important question, and that is about visceral adiposity or intra-abdominal fat, which is, as you know, is a huge risk factor. What is the best way to lose that intra-abdominal fat? Because that's a very cultural thing as well. The thrifty gene theory, etc. So is there anything in particular, a pearl that you can give us about how to get rid of intra-abdominal fat?
Well, unfortunately, there isn't a way to reduce body fat and target it to one area or the other. And so you're going to have to just use the same techniques that I've outlined in the webinar today to reduce overall adiposity. And if most of it is visceral, then that's where the weight loss and the fat cells will come from. Having said that, one thing I didn't mention and people should be aware of is that when you start on a weight loss program, by whatever means I've mentioned this evening, you don't only lose fat, you will lose muscle as well. And up to about 30% of the weight loss might be muscle. Sometimes it's more, and there's a medical term for that called sarcopenic weight loss, where there's a significant amount of muscle lost as well. And so again, it exemplifies and highlights that in order to do this in a healthy way, you can't just focus on the food reduction and the weight loss that way, but there needs to be, particularly if you want to gain back the muscle mass, you need to engage in a proper exercise program with substituting higher protein foods and doing muscle buildup with a personal trainer so that when you start losing the fat and the muscle, you can then convert some of that fat into building up muscle by doing it that way. But unfortunately, I mean, that will reduce visceral fat. If that's where most of your fat is stored, that's where you'll reduce it. But unfortunately, with generalized obesity, and some people have what we call generalized obesity, where it is everywhere, including visceral, unfortunately, there's nothing at this point that we can target one versus the other.
Okay, thank you very much. And the last question, very, very quickly, I think I already discussed that with you a little earlier, is about the exciting new things that GLP-1s are the target organs that seem to be improving with GLP-1 usage. Could you very quickly give us some hopeful information on that?
Yeah, so GLP-1s have effects all throughout the body. I've talked about them here with respect to treating obesity, but as we also alluded to, they're also used to treat diabetes. And they were first discovered to reduce blood sugar levels and to reduce weight. But as you're alluding to now, we're now finding with more and more research that they're being used for other things as well. Some of these are a sort of an offshoot of diabetes because these complications occur more in people with diabetes. But there are studies now showing that GLP-1s will reduce cardiovascular disease. They will reduce heart attack and stroke. They can reduce kidney disease. They've been shown to reduce sleep apnea, which may or may not be related to weight. There's some evidence about Alzheimer's and about brain function because there are GLP-1 receptors in the brain. There are GLP-1 receptors in many different organs. So there's a lot of research going on now looking at more specific targeting of these novel medications for more specific uses.
Well, thank you very, very much, Loren. We've come to the end of the Q&A, and I appreciate very much giving us your time and your wisdom tonight. And now we'll hand this over back to Tina.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Grossman, for your insights. Thank you, Dr. D, for moderating the Q&A. And thank you, audience, for your questions and comments. Dear friends, thank you for attending the webinar tonight. We really hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, Dr. Grossman, for an insightful and informative presentation. We all have learned so much. We would like to thank Dr. D for adding another gem, Dadiri, a new word to our vocabulary, and for moderating the Q&A session. I would also like to thank our entire team of WOW, the Webinar Outreach Wing, who works diligently behind the scenes to bring these popular webinars to you all. Sridhar Rao for Zoom and tech support, Dr. Asha for extending our outreach, distributing the flyers, and for connecting with community organizations and outreach partners. Ashima Jain for running the slideshow tonight, Ashna Roy for creating and designing our flyers and making them bold and eye-catching. I would also like to thank our delightful chair, Smita Chandra, for her leadership. She's currently on a sabbatical, and I hope she'll be back very soon. A big shout out to our ambassadors, Roisin O'Hara and Paul O'Hara, Jamie Stinton, and Dilpreet Bansal for working tirelessly to distribute our flyers. Dear friends, thank you once again for supporting and attending our webinars. We would love your feedback and suggestions for possible topics for future webinars. We request you to answer this short and quick survey to provide your feedback. How useful did you find this webinar? Very useful, somewhat useful, not useful. How did you learn about this webinar? Email from Trivo, Smita Chandra, or from Dr. Sudhi Devanesan, family and friends, local library or community center, Sheridan College Health Clinics, city halls, others. Do you intend to attend our upcoming webinar, Defeating Depression, on April 30th, 2025? And the last question, what topics would you like us to present in the future? Your feedback is very valuable to us, and we do our best to work on the topics that get the most traction, and you will all send us. If you have enjoyed our webinar and would like to support our outreach, please make a donation through our website, www.trivo.org. We request you to please mark your calendars for our upcoming webinar on defeating depression on April 30th, 2025. We hope to see you then. On behalf of the Webinar Outreach Wing of the Ripple Effect Wellness Organization, I would like to thank you all for spending the evening with us. See you at our next webinar in April 2025. Goodbye for now.